There is so much material. I was talking with a friend yesterday, a rabbinic colleague, and he said, "You're doing a whole year on the Passover Seder." So I said, I got the idea a couple of years ago when we did a class just as COVID began on the Passover Seder, and I had an hour and 15 minutes to go over everything and to inspire you for the Passover Haggadah. And I realized this is impossible. And it's always going to be picking and choosing. And I hope already you've seen how incredibly deep this book is. I think we wrote in the advertisement that, what did I write? The greatest book the greatest book ever written. I really think it is. There are few, we know the Bible, and I guess it's not right that I said the greatest book ever written. I should have maybe said the second greatest book ever written. But the Torah wasn't written, it was given. So there, you'll excuse me. But I hope you understand already in this class where I'm coming from, that there really is no controversial, important topic that is in public discourse that the Haggadah does not address somehow. So I thank you for joining me from the beginning, or whenever you started to join up until today for this study. And who knows where it will end? I don't know. Maybe next year we'll have to get to everything that comes after the meal, right? We have to see where we get to day by day. So I want to just do a quick summary of where we were last week. Remember, the central question we asked last week is, why does the Haggadah choose to tell the story of Pesach through the 4 verses in Dvarim, rather than the section in Shmot, which would seem to be, which is the section that actually tells the story of the Exodus, which seems to be a much better fit. And I submitted several different explanations for why it might be the case that these verses were chosen. Remember how the verses begin? Arami Ovedavi Vayered Mitzrayma. Where does this come from? It's the declaration of who? Come on, some of you were at my lecture last week. Who says these words? Originally, who was the one who says these words? The commandment in the Torah is, say this when you do what? Daniel.
When you bring in the Bikurim.
At least I have Daniel. Remember, these are the words that the farmer says when he brings his first fruits to the temple at what is called the Bikurim ceremony. We associate the Bikurim ceremony with which holiday? What's Chag HaBikurim? Shavuot. So we associate Bikurim with Shavuot, but ironically, the central verses of the Bikurim ceremony are in the middle of the Haggadah, the most important part of the Haggadah. They begin with Arami Ovedavi. When the farmer comes to the temple to thank God for the goodness of the land, he must do so with perspective. He must remind himself, where I am now in the land of Israel, enjoying the bounty of my field, this isn't the way it always was. This isn't natural. What was natural? We were slaves. My father was a wandering Aramean. We had no home, right? And only through God's goodness am I able to enjoy literally the fruits of my labor, and I give some of it unto God in gratitude. Is everybody with me? So the question I asked, why these verses? To me, the most powerful answer is to remind us that the story of the Exodus from Egypt must never be read as history, or ought not be read as history. The farmer is doing something right now, that is bringing his fruits to the temple and referencing the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Why? To tell a story? No. It's for perspective. That's what I said. It's so that his actions today can be seen in light, understood in light of where Jewish history was. And it changes what he's doing. To just say thank you, to just bring those fruits without some understanding of why you are bringing those fruits to the temple in the first place. It's not a tax, right? It's there as an expression of gratitude. To me, that is a tremendously important statement that the Haggadah makes about the reason why we're telling the story year after year and day after day. Not as history, but so that our lives today can be seen in perspective. Yes, Gladys. And I know that people on Zoom said I should repeat the questions, so I will do my best. So Gladys is asking, yes?
Yeah, it's just because I wasn't
Yeah.
here last week. Could you repeat that verse and where is it in the Haggadah?
The verse in the Haggadah is, sorry, you mean the text in the Haggadah, Arami Oved Avi. It's right after V'hisha Amda. If you look at V'hisha Amda, it goes Se Ulmad, and then right after Arami Oved Avi. Se Ulmad is an introduction. What does Se Ulmad mean? It means go out and learn. Or I would translate it as now let us learn. Now let us begin to learn. But right after that is Arami Oved Avi. The verses, if you have a Chumash at home, are Deuteronomy 26, verses 5 to 8. Deuteronomy 26, verses 5 to 8. And right, and just a reminder that if you have missed a lecture, anybody who's missed a lecture, they're all recorded. Right, Daniel? They should be on Zoom. If you'd like to not on Zoom, on YouTube. If you'd like to catch up on anything, or if you're not able to make a class, please review online. And also just make sure that you're subscribed to our email list, because like today, the class had to change because of a bar mitzvah this morning. But the rest will be 9:45. We're going to go back to the regular time next week. So Gladys, you're with me. You found the verses. And so last week, what we said is this is the Haggadah. The Haggadah is what does Haggadah mean? The telling, right? The center point, the high point of the Haggadah is when we actually tell the story. That happens in the section of the Haggadah called Magid, related to the same word as Haggadah, Lehagid, Magid, to tell. And the Haggadah chooses these verses to tell the story, right? And as I was saying, I think that it's just brilliant that these are the verse. It's also because it's short. Yes, it's also because these were verses that people knew, because everybody who participated in the Bikurim ceremony had to say these verses, so they already knew them. That's a benefit too. But I think the much deeper reason is because it is a reminder that the story told in retrospect, right, can animate life today. And that is why we have to tell the story. We are, even though it says every generation must see himself as if he himself went forth from Egypt. We didn't get there yet, but most of you know that verse is very famous from the Haggadah. We should see ourselves as if we went out in Egypt. I would say that choosing these verses, the Haggadah is saying every person should see himself as if he was that farmer going to the Bikurim ceremony and saying these verses. It's just that we should see ourselves as a farmer in the sense of we must look at our lives today and understand that this isn't always where we were, seeing lives in retrospect. Okay? So now we're actually going to get into those words, Arami Oved Avi Vayered Mitzrayma. Where we ended off last week was a discussion on why in the introduction to Arami Oved Avi is Lavan brought up, right? So remember, the words Arami Oved Avi probably mean my father was a wandering Aramean. It is the Avi, my father, who is the principal subject in that verse. My father was a wandering Aramean. And why do we say that? Because these verses are all about homelessness and homeness. So it makes sense that when our ancestors are telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, they make a declaration right at the beginning saying, we used to not have a home. We were Arami Oved. We were homeless Arameans. And anyone know where Aram is? Aram means is where? Where's Aram?
Syria.
Syria, that's right. Aram is in modern day Syria. And Abraham comes from around those parts, but others do too in the Bible. So it's not clear that it could be Jacob as well. But either way, both Abraham and Jacob struggle with this idea of homeness. Abraham, who begins his life wandering away from home, and remember, begins the first purchase of the land of Israel, the cave of Machpelah, which is a whole complicated transaction, right? And Jacob also is sort of kicked out of his home, right? Well, he flees his home, but one could say he fled because he wasn't welcome, and also needs to sojourn elsewhere. So in the lives of both of those patriarchs, homeness is a huge theme, and it would make sense, these verses, if it meant Jacob or Abraham used to be a wanderer, and they're our ancestors, and that's our story. We began by wandering, and only after we were redeemed from Egypt did we find a home. However, that's not how the Haggadah translates it. According to the Haggadah, it is not Avi who is the principal subject in this verse. It is Arami, the Aramite, who is the principal subject in the verse. Who is the Aramite? In rabbinic literature, the Aramite is usually Lavan. Lavan, who is from Aram, is called Lavan Ha'arami, and he is the one who was Oved Avi. According to the second interpretation, he manipulated or took advantage of who? Jacob. Very good. And so the beginning, according to the Haggadah, is not a story of us being without a home, but a story of near total annihilation. Very different and much scarier, right? So the Haggadah has this introduction to Arami Oved Avi and says, our story is not going to begin with homelessness. It's going to begin with something even worse. It's going to begin with anti-Semitism. It's going to begin with manipulating other people. So remember the tension between the opinions of Rav and Shmuel in the Talmud. How do we start the story? We know we have to start the story with degradation, genut in Hebrew. But what is genut? For one, it is physical affliction. Physical affliction would be the point of view that we start the story with a story of homelessness. We start to tell the story by being aware of our homeless past. But to the other point of view that says, no, we have this degradation means spiritual affliction. It's not where you are, it's who you are. Well, that point of view, I think, is highlighted in the way the Haggadah understands Arami Oved Avi. Arami Oved Avi, according to the Haggadah, is a story of spiritual annihilation. It could be that Lavan tried at one point to kill Jacob. I did say that there was a verse in the Torah that where Lavan turns to Jacob and says, I could kill you if I wanted to, but Hashem told me not to. So it could be that that's what the Haggadah is talking about, but it's much, much more likely that the Haggadah is talking about Lavan's manipulative ideology, his obsession with materialism, Lavan's desire to assimilate Jacob into that mindset. So Pharaoh only wanted to kill the males. Paro lo gazar ela al hazcharim, it says in the Haggadah. If we're on the page, right, and those of you from home, you can also turn to the page Se Ulmad. Paro lo gazar ela al hazcharim, but Lavan bikesh la'akoret hakol. Lavan wanted to ruin everything. To me, this is spiritual degradation. This is the Haggadah beginning with the story of the Jewish people being brainwashed and thereby disappearing. If Lavan would have got to Jacob, if Jacob wouldn't have gotten up and left, Jacob would not have remained a Jew. Are you with me? Now, the other interpretation, I don't know if some of your Haggadot mentioned this, but I like this one too. How did we end up in Egypt in the first place? Joseph, right? The whole Joseph story. And Lavan's spirit the spirit of hatred, jealousy. Remember what he did with his daughters, and he tried to infect the family with sibling rivalry. So it could be that the Haggadah is saying Lavan almost ruined everything because he injected a spirit of hatred and jealousy into the Jewish people. And I mentioned this last week too, that this is a beautiful lesson about what might be more dangerous to Jewish survival, threats from the outside or threats from the inside. So you choose what you want to talk about at your Seders. Why you think Lavan is worse? Is it because Lavan imposed the threat of assimilation on the Jewish people? Is that the biggest danger? Assimilation? Or is a bigger danger hatred, jealousy, baseless hatred? Is that a bigger threat to the Jewish people? You can choose which one you like with the same text. Are we ready to start? All right, so now let's move forward in the material and begin to actually explain the Midrashim of Arami Oved Avi. It begins with Vayered Mitzrayim. Do you see where you in the Haggadah, Vayered Mitzrayim? So just to review, what is Midrash? In order to understand the Haggadah, you have to understand Midrash. Midrash means taking a verse or a word or even a letter in the Torah and extrapolating from it some deeper meaning. Extrapolating from it to answer perhaps a question that the reader has. So the reader asks a particular question, and then the Midrash says, the answer is in this word. This word gives you the answer. This letter gives you the answer. That's Midrash. So one of the reasons why Arami Oved Avi is such a great series of verses to tell the story of the Haggadah is because it's short. And if we're going to analyze every word or every letter, we can't have, all of Exodus. It'll take a week. But to have 4 verses and go through each word or term to extrapolate some meaning, that we can do. And that is what the Haggadah is going to do. So we take these 4 verses, and now we're going to, over the next couple of weeks, Follow along with the Haggadah's analysis and try and understand what is it that the Haggadah is trying to tell us? What lesson might the Haggadah be trying to convey? And I guarantee you, if I'm doing my job correctly, you will all find things that you did not know were there. Find issues, discussions, challenges, relevant conflicts that the Haggadah is talking about in the way it analyzes these verses. So let's begin. Arami Ovedavi, we know what that means. That Laban came, at least according to the Haggadah, Laban tried to spiritually destroy the Jewish people. Vayered Mitzrayma. You know where we are now? Vayered Mitzrayma. He descended unto Egypt. What does the Midrash say? Anus alpi hadibur. He was compelled to do so because of a command, a dibur, instructions, verbal instructions. So what are we talking about here? In the book of Genesis, if you want me to look it up for you, it's Genesis 46:3. We read the following. I am God, the God of your father, says Hashem to Jacob. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. This is in the middle of the Joseph, or I should say at the end already, of the Joseph saga. And Jacob is very worried about going down to Egypt, even though he wants to see his son. But Hashem says to Jacob, don't worry, you can go. That's what this is about. Anus alpi hadibur. He was permitted to go down to Egypt according to God's word. What's interesting, by the way, is we have old manuscripts of the Haggadah. This verse appears in the Israeli Haggadot. It does not appear in any of the Babylonian Haggadot. That's your hint, right? So that hopefully you can ask, understand the question. I'm giving you a hint so that maybe you understand what this is really about. Why is the Haggadah telling us that Jacob was compelled to go down to Egypt because God told him it was okay? Why do I care that God said that? Yes.
God gave us the land of Israel.
Very good.
That's what we can-
Very, very good. So this is for those online on Zoom, the answer was because God gave us the land of Israel. Let me just expound on that a little bit. What right did Jacob have to leave the land that was promised to him? Right? I know there was a famine, but he could just ask his sons to go and get some food and bring it back. Why do you think this verse may be found in the Israeli Haggadot and not in the Babylonian ones? There's a real question here that, as I said, it's all very relevant, especially now that we have the ability to live in the land of Israel ourselves. There's a question being asked here about where Jews are permitted to live. The Haggadah is uncomfortable with the idea that Jacob can willingly leave the land of Israel in order to be with his family. And so the Haggadah gives him an excuse. It blames God. But by blaming God, it's also telling something to us, isn't it? Isn't the Haggadah also saying, don't you think that you can leave Israel just because Jacob did. Don't think that because Jacob was able to go into the exile to be with his family, that gives you the right to leave the land of Israel to go and be with yours. That's why this verse is found in the Israeli Haggadot, because it's a very Zionist midrash. It's a midrash that's teaching us when you have a home, you don't flee from it when when your family might want you to live elsewhere. And the Babylonian Haggadah don't include this because it's not an issue for them. And if they included this here, they would feel really guilty, wouldn't they? Right? But this is an important verse in Israeli Haggadah because it's warning everybody else, hey, don't think that you can do what Jacob did. Jacob was able to go down because God promised him. This is all in the plan. This is all in the plan. And remember, what is Pesach? Pesach is, according to the Bible, Leil Shimurim, God's watch night, which, if you remember from several months ago, I thought a better translation of Leil Shimurim is not God's watch night, but the night God was shomer, kept his promise to our ancestors. What was the promise? The promise that was made to Abraham in the covenant of the pieces at the beginning of the book of Genesis. God says to Abraham, your descendants will go down to Egypt until the 4th generation, and then I will bring them back. So Pesach is the night where we celebrate God fulfilling the promise of bringing us back to Egypt. It was all back to Egypt, back to the land of Israel. It was all in God's plan. So this actually, it relates very much to Purim, right? Purim is also a story where it looks like natural events are just occurring, but it was all, the message of the Megillah is God is everywhere. God was arranging the whole thing. So this verse is saying the same about God's hand. It was a little bit more explicit here because it's God actually telling Jacob, you can go. That doesn't happen in the Megillah. God doesn't tell Mordechai, put her in the beauty pageant, right? So it's more explicit, but the point is the same. The journey of our people from slavery to freedom was meant to be. God wanted it to happen and wanted to fulfill his word. And that is what we celebrate on Pesach. That is what we are grateful for. That is why it is a Leil Shimurim, the night God kept his promise. So it fits very well with the theme of God, the night God kept his promise, because the story begins with, and Jacob was told by God to go down to Egypt. Jacob being told to go down to Egypt is a very, very difficult thing to understand from a theological perspective. How so? What happened in Egypt? Hundreds of years of suffering and slavery. And the Haggadah says God told Jacob to go to that. God knew that that was going to happen. This is one of the most challenging questions of the whole Haggadah. It doesn't just relate to this verse, it relates to really the beginning of the whole saga, when God tells Abraham, your ancestors will go down to Egypt and will be slaves there. But to me, this is worse. It's because when God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to go down to Egypt, God doesn't say why. In other words, maybe they went down to Egypt and accidentally fell into the hands of Pharaoh. This verse or this midrash is much tougher on God, don't you think? It's not saying it uses the word anus. Anus means compelled. Our ancestors were forced by God to go down to be enslaved. So you could spend your entire Seder focusing on these 4 words. What does it tell us? That God sometimes forces, in this story, it's our ancestors, forces them to enter into a situation of subjugation and degradation and servitude, and forces us in our lives, compels us to endure such situations as well. We don't always have a choice. That's what anus al pi hadibur means. Jacob had no choice. Why do you think Jacob didn't want to go? I mean, God wouldn't have appeared to Jacob and said, it's okay if Jacob wasn't worried. So perhaps Jacob was worried because he said, hey, I'm safe and comfortable here. I don't want to leave. And God, you promised me this land. I don't want to go down. But actually, other midrashim say, no, Jacob knew what was going to happen in Egypt. He foresaw, which is not a crazy thing if you think about it to assume. When you're going to a dangerous country, even remember Abraham and Sarah, when they went down to Egypt, how they had to talk to each other first. And okay, if we get captured, this is what we're going to do. And you're going to tell them that you're not my wife. You remember that whole story when Abraham goes down to Egypt? In other words, Egypt was a scary place. And Jacob was afraid. And God said, you've got to do this. You need to go down. And God even manipulates a little bit and doesn't say that you'll be enslaved. God says, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. I'm going to make you into a great nation there. Don't you worry. Right? So this is a really, really challenging midrash that gives us a lot to think about why we are all compelled sometimes in life to go through difficult circumstances. You want to talk about what, the past 2 years have been like at the Seder. This, if you want to have that be brought forward as a discussion, I know my Seder is going to be pandemic free. We're not allowed to talk about the pandemic, but if you do want to talk now that it's that things are easing up a little bit, and you want to make and you want to have a discussion about, what it's been like for the past 2 years and how do we understand how things like this happen in the world. This is a great opening, because what we're learning is sometimes we have to go through stuff and we don't have a choice. And yet God compels us. We feel compelled to endure it. Maybe when God says, as I read, I will make you a great and mighty nation. When he tells Jacob, don't worry, you can go down. I'll make you into a great and mighty nation. One of the things that we learn is you don't become great and mighty unless you endure some hardship. Right? You may grow in numbers, but maybe God was not referring to the Jewish people growing in numbers. Maybe God was saying, you're going to go through something there that is going to permanently change who you are, what you are about. The Jewish people will be created in Egypt and you will become great and mighty, but it won't be fun. It will be difficult. I don't have answers, right? But the Haggadah provokes discussion. Gladys.
So the parallel with the Holocaust.
The parallel with the Holocaust is obvious. And many, many people have the tradition of doing something at their Seder to talk about the Shoah, to remember victims of the Shoah. And this is a great place, right? Why would God compel people to endure hardship? And it's a very, very challenging question. Yes, Merle.
Question every day about this refrain.
Yeah.
I mean, it's-
Why doesn't God just fix everything for us? And why? So that's about, the answer is this purpose. Life cannot be the Garden of Eden. We tried to do that at the beginning of the Torah, and it was a disaster. God created the world and said, okay, it's going to be a perfect Garden of Eden, and realized that that's not how human nature works, that the world cannot stand in a Garden of Eden perfect world. There needs to be mortality. There needs to be suffering. The human being needs to take agency for herself to make the world better, to bring about redemption. God can't do it. Humanity has to do it. I'm getting deep into theology now, but that's, seems to me to be the message of Egypt and perhaps the message of the Shoah. God doesn't let humanity off the hook and say, you know what, you guys are awful. I'm just going to fix everything. Slavery had to be confronted. God had to play this role. The Jewish people had to endure this because that was the only way to make a declaration to the world that God wanted oppression to end, that God is on the side of freedom. Right? You can't take shortcuts. God can't just snap his fingers and make slavery end and make concentration camps disappear. God relies on humanity to be partners. That's what Tikkun Olam is, right? So, Anus al pi hadibur, 4 words. And you open up a major theological theological discussion. Let's go forward. Vayagor Sham. So you see what the Midrash is doing? It's taking each word or couple of words in these verses and trying to understand some meaning from it. What does Vayagor Sham mean? This teaches that our father, Jacob, did not descend unto Egypt to settle permanently, but only to sojourn temporarily. As it is written, they said to Pharaoh, we have come to temporarily sojourn in this land, since there is no pasture for the flock of your servants, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. This midrash flows very, very well from the last one. If the point of the last midrash, Anus al pi hadibur, is you can't leave the land of Israel unless God gives you permission to do so. If that was the point, then what is this saying? This is further letting Jacob off the hook, isn't it? First, Jacob is left off the hook because it reminds us, hey, God gave him permission to do so. It's not his fault. Don't think you can leave. But here we're letting Jacob off the hook even further. Why? Because we're saying, well, Jacob left, but his intention was to return. He left the land temporarily, but he always had the intention of returning. He left because of a famine. Now, this is found in the Babylonian Haggadah. Why? And what message do you think I get? If I'm sitting in Babylonia and reading the Haggadah in exile, what message is this midrash giving me? Don't forget, Babylonia is not your home. What an amazing, important message for all of us in the diaspora today. It's okay that you're living in exile, but you're there temporarily. This gives us the hashkafa, the how do you translate hashkafa? The philosophy of the Haggadah. The philosophy of the Haggadah is it's The cups of wine are there to lead you to a destination. Veheveti, vehitzalti, vega'alti, velakachti. I'm taking you out and I'm taking you somewhere. This is a very Zionist book. I've said it a million times. And here again, the Haggadah says, okay, if you're going to live in exile, just remember you're there temporarily. The ultimate settlement is in the land of Israel. Whether that means messianic or whether it means just, by our own will, we'll make Aliyah one day. Of course, it can take many generations, but the philosophy of the Haggadah, there's no question, is that exile is not where you're supposed to be. What's also interesting here is it explains why Jacob was intent on living there only temporarily. Why? Why was it that he was there temporarily? It was because of the right. We have nowhere to pasture our sheep. So what's really interesting here in this midrash is, why is it that people are living out? Why is it that Jacob is living in Egypt? Because of the economy, because of money. It's materialism. It's very, very relevant to Babylonian Jewry, who also, why were they living in Babylonia? Because life was good there. Why are we living in New York and Toronto and Miami? Because life is good. And in Israel, it's hard. And it's like the Haggadah is saying, that's okay. It's okay. Even Jacob did that. As long as you have in your mindset that you are there, lagur. Lagur does not mean to settle. It means lehishtakeya, to sojourn permanently. So to sojourn temporarily, excuse me. So that the Midrash is saying, be careful. That word reminds us that Yaakov was not there to live for the long term. Okay? Bimtei me'at. You with me? In small number. As it is written, with 70 persons did our ancestors descend into Egypt, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the heavenly stars. What is the Haggadah trying to tell us here? Right? We read this and say, okay, yeah, that's true. They were small. It was just 70 people that went down with Jacob to Egypt. But Midrash is not just there to give us information. It's always there to make some point. What's the point? If you accept that this is about numbers, right? That the original promise that God made to Jacob, don't worry to go down to Egypt because there I will make you great. If you think that that's about numbers, then that would be correct, right? This is reminding us, hey, we went down there in small number and God fulfilled his promise and made us numerous. So the point of these verses is to remind us that God fulfilled the promise to Jacob and indeed made him great. But dig deeper. And Abraham, correct. But dig deeper. Is this just about numbers? God brought 70 people down to Egypt. What it was likely to happen to 70 people going down to a country of millions of people, perhaps. I don't know how many people lived in Egypt then, but I assume at least hundreds of thousands of people. Exactly. 70 people. There's no way that 70 people would survive in a sea over generations of that many Egyptians. I think this is a major objection that the halacha raises to the idea that small in numbers cannot mean small. I'm trying to understand what I'm saying. Hold on, let me repeat that. It's an objection the halacha that the Haggadah raises to the idea that small in numbers means weak, means incapable of surviving. There's quality and quantity. That's what I was getting at. God brought you down there in 70. With 70 people, don't miss the miracle that happened then. What was the miracle? That those 70 people did not get swallowed up, that somehow they were able to keep their identities over generations. And that is a miracle. Now, remember, the Haggadah is not telling us a story about the past. It's telling us a story about the present. What message does this give to a Jewish community that is small and dispersed and weak and vulnerable around the world? What message is the Midrash giving? You can survive. You don't have to succumb to hopelessness. You don't have to assume that you will be assimilated into the culture surrounding you. Even 70 people, which is nothing within the myriads of the land of Egypt, can survive. Right? And that is a miracle, that God made those 70 people into a nation and that they did not just disappear. So the remembrance of we started out as a small little tribe, some people say that is the biggest miracle there ever was in Judaism. And it's not one that is mentioned explicitly in the Bible. It's not the splitting of the sea or the giving of the Torah or the 10 plagues. It's just the miracle of still being around. Right? So this is a great opening for a discussion in your Seder about how is it that we today in small numbers remain, what is it that keeps us surviving? What enables us? Is it accommodation, or is it not accommodation? Is it boundaries? Well, guess what? The Haggadah is going to give us an answer to that too. What's the time, Daniel?
It's 11:19.
And what time are we ending? Oh, I think I was supposed to end 5 minutes ago. What? Right? No. When was it? It's an hour and 15 minutes. 11:45. Okay. All right. Good. We still have time. Okay. So you see how this all flows. If you follow me, this all flows. So the question is posed: how can 70 people survive? How could such a miracle have occurred? Now, let's see. Next. Vayehi sham legoy melamed shehayu Yisraelim metsuyanim sham. This teaches that the Israelites excelled there. What does your Haggadah say? Your English translation, what does mitsuyanim mean? That's what I like more. What does mitsuyan mean? I used to get in Hebrew school, where if I did really well on my test, the teacher would say, mitsuyan, excellent. But what does it really mean? Matsui in Hebrew is a find. It's something that is distinct, different. Mitsuyan means excellent, but in the sense of outstanding. That to me is a better translation. Not because what does outstanding mean? It means you've separated from the rest. Yotze min haklal. Metsuyan means, so look at how this flows so nicely in the Haggadah. How did 70 people stay distinct? Well, they were mitsuyanim. And there are many, many midrashim that say that there were certain customs that the Jews kept in Egypt that made sure that they would be differentiated from the Egyptians surrounding them. I shouldn't say Jews, I should say Israelites, right? They weren't Jews yet. There's a famous Tanaitic midrash, that's an early midrash, that says the Jews kept their sexual boundary laws. The Egyptians had all sorts of different sex cults, and the Israelites refused to participate in any of them. They had a different morality when it came to intimate relationships. That's number one. Number two, they never spoke Lashon Hara. This is what the midrash says, right? Number three, they never changed their names to become Egyptian names. And number four, they kept their language. There's an addition there that says they also kept their clothing. If you're familiar with that midrash, it says, it's not clear, but there's additions to the midrash that they also dress differently. The point is not in which ways, right? These are different ways. I don't know which ones are true and which ones are not true. But there's a general point being made by the Haggadah, which is a message to Jews that are few in number and worried about assimilating. And that is, we didn't just survive because of some miracle from heaven. The Jews, the Israelites at that time, took upon themselves to set boundaries. They did not assimilate totally because they kept certain things distinct. That's a huge message for ongoing generations. You want to stay distinct and be small in number? It takes effort. You can't just pray to God, please don't let us assimilate. If you want to stay distinct, you have to understand boundaries. Take upon yourself to do things differently than others. And to me, a huge one is language. Huge is language. I love that is mentioned explicitly in that midrash because it's something that we can relate to today. If you don't give somebody the tools to understand their heritage, and language is the most important one, don't expect them to just say, this is too complicated for me, and I'm gonna just assimilate, and I'll see what I can do I'll see how I can live a Jewish life without knowing how to open up Hebrew and read Aleph Beis, right? So this is a great verse for Jewish education. This is a great midrash for Jewish education. How do you survive? How do you live as a distinct minority? Be metsuyan. Be distinct. Don't be afraid to be different. On the other hand, who can read Rav? Oh, sorry, Gadol and Atzum. Barav. A great and mighty nation. I think I'll just read actually so that people on Zoom can hear. I hope that's okay. A great nation, mighty, as it is written, and the children of Israel were fruitful, increased prolifically, multiplied, and became exceedingly strong, and the land was filled with them. A great and mighty nation. They became strong. The land was filled with them. Does this sound like a group of people who were suffering? Does this sound like a group of people who were targeted for anti-Semitism? And if you keep reading Varav, let's keep going with the next midrash. Oh wait, no, let's not go there yet. Sorry. Let's just stick with Gadol and Atzum. Gadol means big. Atzum means what? How does your Haggadah translate Atzum? Mighty. Mighty. Powerful. Well, if our ancestors were completely distinct and isolated themselves completely from Egyptian society, it would seem to reason that they wouldn't become so powerful and big. How does a group of people grow numerous, both quantitatively and qualitatively? Atzum varav definitely means they not only grew in number, but they grew in might. How does that happen? Does it happen by separating yourself completely from Egyptian society? Could that possibly happen? No. So to me, there's this very interesting interplay between the two ideas. On one hand, metsuyanim. They were different and distinct and kept certain ideas separate. But Atzum Varav teaches something else. Atzum Varav says, but they weren't completely separate. They also participated in Egyptian life. They also benefited from Egyptian life. Maybe they were involved in the Egyptian economy. Joseph was. Why would it be so crazy to think that his children would be involved in Egyptian life? So look at how everything flows in this midrash. You have a group of people who are coming down very small in number. They really ought to have assimilated. But why did they not assimilate? Was it a miracle? Maybe. But it also could be that they were able to navigate the tensions between being metsuyanim, being different, and being atzum varav, or gadol ve'atzum, and being part of the larger Egyptian society and economy. They would not have become, folks, you won't find this in the art scroll or any Orthodox Haggadah, but I'm telling you my own opinion. This is a conservative synagogue where that tension is everything we talk about. How do you live lives that at the same time can be engaged in secular society but remain mitsuyanim, remain Jewish? That's why I love this section of the Midrash. We would not have grown in number if all we would have done would be atzum v'gadol. If our only drive was the materialism of Egypt, we would have disappeared. But if our only drive would have been to be mitsuyanim, to be distinct and separate ourselves, we also would have disappeared. So the Midrash is saying, Vayagor sham bimtei me'at vayhi sham legoy gadol ve'atzum. There they became a nation, distinct, different, but were still gadol ve'atzum, but still engaged, participating in the larger Egyptian society. And that's how they grew from small to big. Yes. By the way, is that so crazy, or isn't that obvious when you think about it? It's obvious. A group of people that was we forget, because all we think about is all the Haggadah. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Margaret, but all we think about, I want to say it before I lose my train of thought. All we think about our time in Egypt is slavery, but we forget. Why did Pharaoh enslave the Jews? Well, but why? What did he say? They were a threat. Well, no, 70 people are not a threat. So obviously, by the time that from when the new king arose over Egypt, by the time that happened, the Jews had grown to be threatening. They had already increased in number. They had benefited from Egyptian society. Part of the story of the Exodus from Egypt is not just slavery, but how we became a great and mighty nation there. Right? And you can't just talk about anti-Semitism without understanding that anti-Semitism is often the reaction of non-Jews who perceive Jews as a threat for the very reason that they become too influential. This is the Midrash. The Jews are controlling everything. That's not 70 people. It's like they allowed the Jewish people to become a great and mighty nation, but ad kan. And it's only when they became great and mighty and remained distinct that Pharaoh says, we need to enslave you. Right? In other words, the very secret to Jewish survival is what makes us be perceived as a threat by others. People don't like people who are different. The fact that we are mitsuyanim, qualitatively and quantitatively distinct, proves to be the threat to Pharaoh. That is part of our story. Egypt wasn't all bad. We did well until we did too well. Thank you.
Reiterated what I was going to say.
Okay, what were you going to say, Marlene?
No,
Repeat it so everybody can hear. Yes.
No, basically, I was going to say that because they gained power, they became a threat, which was why they wound up as slaves.
Because they, say that again, because they gained power, they became a threat. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because they gained in power and influence, they became a threat to others. And that's when Pharaoh decides to enslave them. Okay, so maybe we'll end there. Right? I think because the next one sort of begins, slavery begins with the next word. Let's just do one last word. Merle, you have to go. Okay, we'll end because no, it's okay. We'll end, but I'll just say this is the background. Remember, slavery has not started yet in these 4 verses. We're just telling the background story. The background story is a group of people who are compelled to leave their homeland, endure suffering by God, a small in number, but eventually they grow. And now we see how their growth became almost invited the Vayareo Otanu Hamitzrim, which comes next. So next week, we're back again at 9:45. Of course, yes.
The text reads, the Syrians sought to destroy my father and went down to Egypt. If I were reading this for the first time, I would think he went down to Egypt to escape from the Syrian, whereas the story is quite different.
The story is different, right? Unless, so if you're reading the text saying an Assyrian thought to destroy my father and he went down to Egypt, unless you connect the 2 events such that you would propose that the reason why we ended up down in Egypt was because of Lavan. Now, how would that make sense? Lavan didn't say go down to Egypt. But I proposed an interpretation, which you will find in many Haggadot, which explains that Lavan inserted jealousy and sibling rivalry into the Jewish people. And since the story of Joseph, which is a story of sibling rivalry, that is the reason why we went down to Egypt. The way you read that text makes sense. Do you see that? The Aramite came to destroy my father with hatred. And thus, we were compelled to go down to Egypt because that hatred festered within the Jewish people until the brothers threw Joseph in a pit, etc., etc. With me?
Yes.
Okay. But I don't think it's one interpretation, not my favorite. But part of what I'm trying to convey in the Haggadah is that this is a text that you can read in many different ways. And depending on what mood you're in, you can navigate many different conversations on many different topics with the same 3 words, right? Which is what makes it really an incredible book. Okay, see you next week, 9:45. Oh, there's a question online. Yes.
Rosalind, you want to ask?
Roz?
It's me. So wasn't Jacob compelled to go down there because Joseph wouldn't give the brothers the grain unless they brought their father down? So it was in the Joseph story. Joseph tells his brothers that, that's the whole dialogue with the grain and he wants to see his brother and his father. And so
but Joseph didn't threaten. Joseph didn't threaten and say, if you don't bring my father down here, I'm going to keep you as prisoners. He turns to his brothers and says, is dad still okay?
Right.
And remember, then he sends this great chariot to go and get Jacob and bring him down to Egypt. But it wasn't a threatening thing. It was an invitation to come down to Egypt. And Jacob was very nervous about doing that. But God says, don't worry, you go and I'll be with you and good things will happen there.
So you don't think he had any idea that he was going to see his favored son?
No, he did. Jacob knew by the time that the chariots came and picked him up. I have to make sure that I'm remembering the story correctly, but do some of you, am I on the right page? By the time the chariots came to pick up Jacob already knew that he was alive.
So
that's why there were Egyptian chariots that came.
But isn't that an amazing
to pick him up?
Right. So isn't that an amazing reason to go to Egypt? I mean,
of course it's an amazing, but Jacob still hesitated.
Right.
Right. Why did Jacob hesitate? Because God said, this is your land. And Egypt was a scary place to go to, even when a limo's coming to pick you up. Jacob that's why I think that it is plausible to put forward the idea that Jacob foresaw that Egypt would be in time would lead to bad things. Probably someone told him, hey, remember the prophecy that God made to your grandfather where he said, Egypt, you're going to go down to Egypt and bad things are going to happen. So it's not unreasonable to think that Jacob knew about that prophecy and says to himself, maybe I shouldn't go down. Maybe bad things are going to happen there. And yet God says, do it.
Obedience. Okay, thank you. Great lecture.
Yeah, obedience, right. But the challenge is it's obedience to a God who's bringing the people to a place where they will be oppressed and enslaved. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to be obedient to a God who says, go here and good things will happen. But what about obedience to a God who says, do this and you are going to endure some bad things? And that's the real theological challenge that the Haggadah, I think, raises here. Marcia? Why didn't Joseph come to see Jacob? Yes, I think that's a question that Rashi asks. And if I remember correctly, if I remember correctly, I think the reason that Joseph doesn't go get him and Joseph asks him to be brought down is because he wants Jacob to see what's happened, his palace, and he wants Jacob to feel right. Yeah. Come see my mansion that I live in and the cars that I own, right? But it's a fair question. And perhaps Pharaoh didn't let him leave, right? He's a very important person. The viceroy of Egypt can't always leave. Remember what happened to our Ontario's finance minister who wanted to go to the Bahamas during the pandemic? When there's a famine, right? It's sort of the same thing. When there's a famine, you can't go on any vacations, right? You stay here and suffer with us. They weren't suffering. They had grain, but it was because of him they had grain. So come manage the program. You can't go visit your father. Remember, a trip to Egypt is a trip to go to Canaan is not exactly, an express. They didn't have an express train. It was probably very difficult for Joseph to leave for such an extended period of time, given his responsibilities in Egypt. Easier to send a limo to get his dad. Yeah.
I think we should have an election now. Ford is like Pharaoh.
Have a good day, everybody. I'm not getting.
Thank you.